The room pulsed with laughter, sharp and careless, as they mocked her without a second thought. One woman stood alone, weathering a storm of cruel glances and a single barbed insult that sparked a wave of smug chuckles. No one bothered to wonder about the scars etched into her skin. No one cared enough to ask. But in the shadows, a lone figure watched, silent and sharp-eyed, piecing together a truth they'd all overlooked. He'd seen that symbol before its meaning burned into his memory. In mere moments, every smug face in that room would freeze, wishing they'd held their tongues. Some secrets don't just sting, they unravel everything. What do you think happens when the truth comes crashing down? Drop your guess in the comments before the story unfolds. Which city in the United States are you watching from? Share your thoughts and let us know if you've ever clashed with an HOA. We'd love to narrate your story on our channel. Beth Carter stood in her trailer's cramped bedroom, staring into a cracked mirror that caught the dim glow of a flickering bulb. Her fingers traced the scars, snaking down her arms, not with shame, but with quiet reverence for the choices and sacrifices they carried. She glanced at the black, modest dress draped across her bed, a gift from Frank Miller, her boss and only true ally. A cream-colored invitation to Chase Morrison's lavish 30th birthday bash sat on her dresser, its gold lettering gleaming like a taunt from a world that wasn't hers. Slipping into the dress, she felt its unfamiliar softness against her skin, too pristine, too polished for someone whose days were steeped in the flour and sugar of Miller's bakery. But Frank had insisted, practically pressing the dress into her hands when she'd hesitated, shown him the invitation 3 weeks ago. You deserve to have some happy moments, Beth. He had said, his weathered hands gentle as he folded the dress carefully. Don't let the past hold you back forever. Her mind flashed back to a red dirt training ground, the Georgia sun blinding. Everyone's going to see you as the week 1 Carter, the drill sergeant had said, eyes narrowed like a hawk, sizing up prey until you fire your first shot. That voice had followed her through mortar shells and machine gun nests, through nights when death felt closer than her own heartbeat. It steadied her now as she reached for her makeup bag, applying just enough foundation to even out her complexion and a touch of lipstick to give herself some color. The phone buzzed on her nightstand. Frank's name lit up the cracked screen she didn't need to answer. She could still hear his voice from earlier, warm and encouraging, despite the concern that always crept in when he talked about her social life. Beth, you deserve to be anywhere you want to be. Don't let the past make your decisions for you. She nodded more to herself than to the empty room and reached for the most precious thing she owned, a metal chain that held a small tag, worn smooth by years of handling the dog. Tag was her secret, her connection to a life she'd left behind. When the nightmares became too much and the memories too heavy to carry in uniform, she fastened the chain around her neck, tucking it carefully under her collar where it rested against her heart like a talisman. The metal felt warm against her skin, a reminder of who she was beneath the surface, of the strength that had carried her through trials these party-goers couldn't begin to mimic. Taking a deep breath that filled her lungs with determination, she grabbed her car keys and headed for the door. Her old sedan wheezed up the valet lane like it didn't belong there, just like her Mercedes gleamed under the restaurant's lights. BMWs purred with quiet authority. White-gloved doormen moved with practiced efficiency, their uniforms crisp Enough to cut glass, grand view. Restaurant towered above her all, glass and steel and golden light spilling from windows that probably cost more than she made in a year. She clutched the dog tag under her collar like armor, feeling its familiar weight against her chest. "I can do this," she whispered to her reflection in the rear view mirror and stepped out. The valet's eyes swept from her dented car to her discount dress, but Beth held her head high as she walked toward the entrance. The marble steps felt solid under her feet, each one taking her further from the world she knew and deeper into one that had never welcomed people like her. Through the massive window, she could see the party in full swing, men in expensive suits raising crystal glasses, women in designer dresses, laughing at jokes she would never understand. But she had walked through valleys of death and emerged stronger. A few disapproving looks wouldn't break her now. The moment Beth stepped into the restaurant's opulent lobby, conversations paused like a record. Skipping, one woman's eyes scanned her up and down, then whispered something urgent to a man in a navy suit. Beth didn't flinch, she didn't blink. She took a glass of water from a passing server. Champagne was for people who belonged here, and stepped to the side of the main dining area. The restaurant buzzed with the kind of conversation that came from lives lived without worry, discussions of vacation homes and investment portfolios that might as well have been in a foreign language. Under the crystal chandelier, the chain around her neck caught the light for just a moment, glinting like a star through the thin fabric of her dress, and for just a second, someone noticed. The elderly woman in pearls stopped mid-sentence, her eyes narrowing as she tried to make sense of what she'd seen. Beth moved to a corner where she could observe without being the center of attention, but she could feel the weight of dozens of stares following her every movement. The whispers started immediately rippling through the crowd like stones thrown into still water. Who is she? How did someone like that get invited? Look at her dress. Is that from a thrift store? Beth forced herself to stand straighter, to meet their gazes with the same steady eyes that had stared down enemy combatants across desert valleys. These people had never been tested by anything more challenging than choosing between luxury cars, but they looked at her like she was the one who didn't measure up. The irony wasn't lost on her that the very people who benefited from her service were the ones looking down on her now. But she had learned long ago that respect had to be earned, not given, and tonight she would earn theirs, whether they wanted to give it or not. The drill sergeant's words echoed in her mind like a mantra. Everyone would see her as weak until they knew the truth. She touched the hidden dog tag once more, drawing strength from the metal that connected her to a past. These people would never understand. The scars on her arms might mark her as different, but they also marked her as someone who had chosen to stand when others would have fallen, someone who had sacrificed so others could sleep safely in their beds. On the far side of the room, Chase Morrison spotted her from his position near the bar. His smile curled like a blade as he took in her modest dress and obvious discomfort. He had plans for tonight, plans that would provide entertainment for his wealthy friends at the expense of the quiet girl who had never fought back in high school. Plans he'd soon regret. Chase Morrison made his way across the dining room with the confident stride of someone who had never been denied anything in his life. At 30 years old, he stood 6'1" in tall, impeccably dressed in an Armani suit with a Rolex gleaming on his wrist. He was the heir to Morrison Industries, the largest real estate development company in the state, and he had learned early that his wealth and status gave him license to do whatever he pleased when he spotted Beth standing alone in the corner. A cruel smile spread across his face. He remembered the quiet girl from high school, the one who had always kept to herself and never fought back when people made fun of her worn-out clothes. Tonight, she would provide perfect entertainment for his wealthy friends. Beth Carter. Chase called out loudly as he approached, his voice carrying across the dining area, where 40 or 50 patrons were enjoying their evening meals. He deliberately guided her toward the center of the dining room, where his voice would carry further and draw more attention. Everyone, I want you to meet my old classmate. He gestured grandly, ensuring that nearby tables turned to look at them. This is Beth. She works at a bakery, Miller's Bakery, I believe. You know, the little place downtown. The condescension in his voice was unmistakable as he made sure to emphasize her humble profession. Beth felt her face flush red as dozens of eyes focused on her. I didn't come here to be judged, Chase, she said quietly, hoping to diffuse the situation before it escalated. Chase laughed loudly, making sure his voice carried throughout the dining area. Judged? I'm just curious, that's all. He turned to address the watching diners directly. But what I'm really curious about are those interesting scars on her arms. What happened there? Kitchen accident? The question hung in the air like smoke, and Beth could feel the eyes of every person in the dining room boring into her. The whispers began immediately. Look at her arms. How awful. Why would they invite someone like that? She tried to pull her sleeves down further, but the fabric wouldn't stretch anymore, leaving her scars partially visible. Chase's smile grew wider as he saw her discomfort feeding off her pain before Beth could react. Chase grabbed her wrist and yanked up her sleeve in one swift motion, exposing the network of scars that ran up her arm. Wow, look at this, everyone, he announced triumphantly. That's quite a collection you've got there. And crashed to the marble floor with a sharp crack that echoed throughout the restaurant. The sound seemed to freeze time as conversation stopped mid-sentence, and every person in the dining room turned to stare. A small child at a nearby table pointed and asked loudly, Mommy, what's wrong with that lady's arms? The comments from nearby diners grew louder and more cruel. That's disgusting. Refused to break completely. The metal chain around her neck had shifted during the struggle. As she watched the cruel spectacle unfold, her name was Sarah, and she had been working at Phonin. Began recording initially, just capturing what seemed like another rich person's tantrum. But as she watched Beth's dignified response to the humiliation, something told her this moment was more significant than it appeared. Sarah zoomed in on Beth's face, capturing the tears that threatened to spill over but hadn't yet fallen. The way she held her head high, despite the cruelty being directed at her, there was something in the woman's bearing that spoke of strength forged in far greater trials than this public humiliation. The server didn't know it yet, but her decision to record would soon change everything for everyone involved, turning a moment of private walls of this exclusive restaurant. Beth looked directly into Chase's eyes and said in a voice that was stronger than she felt, "Let go of my arm right now." There was something in her tone that surprised even her, a hardness that Chase hadn't expected from the timid girl he remembered from high school, an authority that seemed to come from somewhere deep within her core. The command in her voice came from years of making life and death decisions in situations far more dangerous than this restaurant. though no one in the room could have guessed that her quiet demeanor concealed such depths of experience and strength. But unbeknownst to Beth and Chase, their cruel spectacle had drawn the attention of someone who saw things very differently than the rest of the crowd. From his seat at the bar in the corner of the restaurant, a man with graying hair and intense eyes had been watching the entire scene unfold. When Chase pulled up Beth's sleeve and the metal chain caught the light, the man's expression changed from casual interest to shocked recognition. He set down his whiskey with a sharp clink against the wooden bar and stood up slowly, his weathered face showing a mixture of seen enough cruelty in his 58 years to recognize it immediately. But what he was seeing around Beth's neck was something that made his blood run cold with a very different kind of recognition. Chase Morrison made his way across the dining room with the confident stride of someone who had never been denied anything in his life. Real estate development company in the state, and he had learned early that his wealth and status gave him license to do whatever he pleased. Quiet girl from high school, the one who had always kept to herself and never fought back when people made fun of her worn-out clothes. As he approached, his voice carrying across the dining area where 40 or 50 patrons, "I want you to meet my old classmate." He gestured grandly, ensuring that nearby tables turned to look at them. "This is Beth. She works at a bakery, Miller's Bakery, I believe. You know, the little place downtown." The condescension in his voice was unmistakable as he made sure to emphasize her humble profession. Beth felt her face flush red as dozens of eyes focused on her. "I didn't come here to be judged, Chase," she said quietly, hoping to diffuse the situation before it escalated. Chase laughed loudly, making sure his voice carried throughout the dining area. "Judged? I'm just curious, that's all." He turned to address the watching diners directly. "But what I'm really curious about are those interesting scars on her arms. What happened there? Kitchen accident?" The question hung in the air like smoke, and Beth could feel the eyes of every person in the dining room boring into her. The whispers began immediately. "Look at her arms. How awful. Why would they invite someone like that?" She tried to pull her sleeves down further, but the fabric wouldn't stretch anymore, leaving her scars partially visible. Chase's smile grew wider as he saw her discomfort feeding off her pain. He announced triumphantly, "That's quite a collection you've got there." In her shock and struggle to free herself, the glass of water slipped from her other hand and crashed to the marble floor with a sharp crack that echoed throughout the restaurant. The sound seemed to freeze time as conversation stopped mid-sentence, and every person in the dining room turned to stare. A small child at a nearby table pointed and asked loudly, "Mommy, what's wrong with that lady's arms?" The comments from nearby diners grew louder and more cruel. "That's disgusting. How do they let people like that into places like this? Is it contagious?" Beth felt like she was drowning in their judgment, but something deep inside her refused to break completely. The metal chain around her neck had shifted during the struggle and now caught the restaurant's bright lights glinting visibly against her dark dress. A young server with brown hair clutched her tray of glasses tighter as she watched the cruel spectacle unfold. Her name was Sarah, and she had been working at Grandview for 2 years, long enough to see plenty of entitled customers. But this level of cruelty made her stomach turn. Without thinking, she pulled out her phone and began recording, initially just capturing what seemed like another rich person's tantrum. But as she watched Beth's dignified response to the humiliation, something told her this moment was more significant than it appeared. Sarah zoomed in on Beth's face, capturing the tears that threatened to spill over but hadn't yet fallen. The way she held her head high despite the cruelty being directed at her. There was something in the woman's bearing that spoke of strength forged in far greater trials than this. Would soon change everything for everyone involved. Turning a moment of private was stronger than she felt. Let go of my arm right now. There was something in her tone that surprised even her, a hardness that Chase hadn't expected from the timid girl. He remembered from high school an authority that seemed to come from somewhere deep within her core. The command in her voice came from years of making life and death decisions in situations far more dangerous than this restaurant. Demeanor concealed such depths of experience and strength, but unbeknownst to Beth and Chase, their cruel spectacle had drawn the attention of someone who saw things very differently than the rest of the crowd. From his seat at the bar in the corner of the restaurant, a man with graying hair and intense eyes had been watching the entire scene unfold. When Chase pulled up Beth's sleeve and the metal chain caught the light, the man's expression changed from casual interest to shocked recognition. He set down his whiskey with a sharp clink against the wooden bar and stood up slowly, his weathered face showing a mixture of disbelief and growing anger. Robert Tank Williams had seen enough cruelty in his 58 years to recognize it immediately. But what he was seeing around Beth's neck was something that made his blood run cold. With a very different kind of recognition, Tank positioned himself between Beth and Chase, his presence commanding the attention of everyone in the restaurant. Servers stopped moving between tables, diners put down their forks, and even the kitchen staff peered out to see what was happening. Tank's voice carried the authority of someone who had commanded Alpha Base, Afghanistan, August 2019. He began, his eyes never leaving Chase's face. 50 enemy combatants surrounded 8 of us. Hum of the air conditioning and the distant clatter of dishes in the kitchen. Sergeant Carter here was our sniper. Tank continued, gesturing toward Beth with obvious respect. She could have retreated safely through the tunnel system behind the base standard. Protocol would have been for her to fall back and save herself. The crowd around them had grown larger as diners left their tables to listen, drawn by the gravity in Tank's voice. An elderly woman in pearls pressed her hand to her chest, while a middle-aged businessman loosened his tie as if the tension was making it difficult to breathe. Chase tried to interrupt, his voice cracking, "I don't believe this." But Tank silenced him with a look that could have frozen fire. "You've said enough, boy. Now it's time for you to listen to how a real hero behaves." Tank's voice grew stronger as he continued his words, painting pictures that held the entire restaurant captive. But Beth Carter didn't retreat. She stayed and fought 6 straight hours without leaving her position. She saved 8 lives that day, including mine. He paused, looking around the room at faces that had transformed from cruel amusement to rapt attention. The young server who had been recording lowered her phone, realizing she was witnessing something far more significant than she had initially understood. A champagne glass slipped from someone's trembling fingers and shattered on the floor. But no one looked away from Tank. "Those marks you've been laughing at," he said, pointing to Beth's exposed scars. "Those are from grenade fragments and rifle rounds. Every single scar represents a moment when she chose to save someone else's life instead of protecting herself." The silence in the restaurant was profound as the weight of Tank's words settled over the crowd. Beth stood silently beside him, tears streaming down her face, as memories she had tried to bury came flooding back. But she remained standing straight, drawing strength from Tank's words and the respect in his voice. If not for Sergeant Carter, 8 families would have received folded flags instead of their sons and husbands coming home. She is the reason I'm standing here talking to you tonight, instead of lying in Arlington Cemetery. The emotion in Tank's voice was unmistakable, and several people in the crowd were openly wiping away tears. The transformation in the room was complete. What had begun as entertainment at Beth's expense had become a moment of reckoning for everyone who had participated in her humiliation. Beth opened her eyes and spoke for the first time since Tank had begun his story, her voice clear and strong despite the tears on her cheeks. I didn't fight in Afghanistan so I could come home and be treated with contempt in my own country. The simple statement carried more power than any speech, and its impact on the crowd was immediate. People began looking ashamed, some covering their faces with their hands, others staring at the floor in embarrassment. Chase's face had gone pale, and he was looking around desperately, as if searching for an escape route. The transformation in the room was palpable. The same people who had been laughing at Beth's scars were now looking at her with a mixture of awe and shame. Tank wasn't finished yet. Every person in this room owes their freedom to people like Sergeant Carter. While you were sleeping safely in your beds, she was fighting to make sure you could wake up in a free country. His words hung in the air like a challenge, and the shame on the faces around them was palpable. The elderly woman was openly weeping now, her makeup streaking down her cheeks as she realized the enormity of what she had witnessed. The businessman had gone pale, his wife beside him looking as if she might be sick. Even the servers looked stricken, though they had played no part in the evening's cruelty. Chase tried one more time to speak. I didn't know, but his words sounded hollow and pathetic, even to his own ears. Beth looked at him with eyes that held no hatred, only disappointment. That's exactly the problem, Chase. You didn't know, and you didn't care to find out. You just saw scars and decided I was less than human. The truth of her words had settled over the room like a weight, and Chase Morrison realized that his night of entertainment had become something very different indeed. The young server clutched her phone tighter, knowing that what she had captured was more than just a social media moment. It was a story that needed to be told to the world. Several people in the crowd began to approach Beth, their faces showing genuine remorse for their earlier behavior. A middle-aged woman stepped forward, tears in her eyes. "Ma'am, I'm so sorry. I had no idea." Others followed, offering apologies and thanks for her service. The atmosphere in the restaurant had completely transformed from one of cruel entertainment to something approaching reverence. Chase stood isolated in the middle of the growing crowd around Beth, suddenly alone. Despite being surrounded by people his friends had quietly moved away from him, unwilling to be associated with someone who had so publicly humiliated a war hero. Tank watched with satisfaction as the truth finally came to light, knowing that Beth was finally receiving the respect she had always deserved. But he also knew that this was just the beginning. The young server was still recording, and Tank could see the determination in her eyes. This story wouldn't stay contained within the walls of this restaurant. It would spread, and Chase Morrison would soon learn that there were consequences for cruelty, especially when directed at those who had sacrificed everything for their country. The reckoning had begun, and there was no stopping it now. Tank looked around the room, ensuring He had everyone's complete attention before continuing with the most important part of Beth's story. The restaurant remained utterly silent, with even the background music having been turned off by management, who recognized that something significant was happening in their establishment. Several people had moved closer, forming a circle around Beth and Tank, their faces showing a mixture of shame and growing respect. Chase stood on the outside of this circle, looking increasingly isolated as more people turned their backs on him. The transformation in the room was complete, but Tank wasn't finished with his story yet. The United States government nominated Beth Carter for the Medal of Honor, the highest decoration our nation can bestow upon a member of the armed forces, Tank announced, his voice carrying a reverence that made everyone in the room understand the magnitude of what he was saying. In honor that has been given to fewer than 4,000 people in our nation's entire history. The weight of those words settled over the crowd like a blanket, and several people gasped audibly. Chase's confusion was evident on his face as he struggled to process this information, while the crowd around them began to realize they had been witness to something far more serious than they had initially understood. A Medal of Honor recipient, the woman they had been mocking, could have been honored at the White House. Chase managed to stammer out a question that revealed his complete inability to comprehend the situation. Then why is she here, working at a bakery? The question hung in the air, exposing not just his ignorance, but his fundamental misunderstanding of what truly mattered in life. Beth looked at Chase for a long moment, then reached into her small purse and pulled out a worn wallet. From it, she extracted a faded photograph, a simple snapshot of a middle-aged woman with kind eyes and a gentle smile, clearly taken in a hospital room. Her hands were steady now, no longer trembling as they had earlier in the evening. "This is my mother," Beth said simply, holding the photograph so that everyone nearby could see it. Her voice was clear and strong, carrying an authority that came from absolute certainty about her choices. "She was diagnosed with terminal cancer while I was still serving. Stage 4. The doctors gave her 6 months to live, maybe less. I had a choice to make: accept the Medal of Honor ceremony at the White House with all the fanfare and attention that comes with it, or come home and spend my mother's final months taking care of her." She paused, looking around at the faces surrounding her, seeing understanding beginning to dawn in their eye. "I chose my mother. I chose love over glory. I chose family over fame." Beth carefully tucked the photograph back into her wallet, her movements deliberate and respectful. "I held her hand every day for 4 months until she passed away. I cooked her favorite meals when she could still eat. I read her the same romance novels she'd loved when I was a child. I made sure she wasn't afraid when the end came." Her voice carried no regret, only a quiet satisfaction that came from knowing she had made the right choice. "The military understood," they said. "The medal would be there whenever I was ready. But some things matter more than recognition. Some things matter more than glory." The silence that followed was profound and respectful, broken only by the sound of someone quietly weeping. An elderly woman in an elegant dress stepped forward, tears streaming down her face. That was the most beautiful thing I've ever heard," she whispered. "I'm so sorry for how we treated you. I'm so ashamed." Others began to nod in agreement, the reality of their earlier cruelty hitting them like physical blows. The woman they had mocked and ridiculed had given up the highest honor their country could bestow. In order to care for her dying mother, one by one, people began to stand and applaud. It started with the elderly woman, then spread to the businessman who had loosened his tie, then to the young server who had been recording. Everything within moments. The entire restaurant was on its feet, giving Beth a standing ovation that seemed to go on forever. Tank stood at attention and saluted Beth once again, this time holding the salute as the applause continued around them. Several people approached Beth to shake her hand and thank her for her service, their shame evident in their faces and voices. After the applause finally died down, a middle-aged woman approached Beth hesitantly. She was well-dressed, but not ostentatious, with kind eyes that reminded Beth of her mother. "Excuse me," the woman said softly. "I hope you don't mind me asking, but weren't you scared, not in the war, but afterwards, coming back to regular life?" Beth considered the question carefully, recognizing the genuine curiosity and concern behind it. "Every day," she answered honestly, "but not of the things you might think. I was scared every time I had to turn my back on someone, wondering if they saw me as a person worth knowing, or just as someone to be pied or avoided." The woman nodded, understanding flickering in her eyes, and now she asked. Beth looked around the restaurant, at the faces that had transformed from cruel amusement to genuine respect. At Tank, standing proudly beside her. At Chase, standing alone and diminished. "Now I remember that most people are good, they just sometimes forget to act like it. Tonight reminded me why I fought in the first place. For people who deserve better than they sometimes give themselves credit for." Chase stood isolated in the middle of what had become a celebration of Beth's courage and sacrifice, surrounded by people who now looked at him with undisguised contempt. His phone had been buzzing constantly, but he was afraid to look at it, afraid of what he might find. The evening that had begun as his moment of cruel entertainment had become something else entirely, a public reckoning that would follow him far beyond the walls of this restaurant. He tried one more time to approach Beth, but Tank stepped between them, his message clear, without words. Some lines once crossed could not be uncrossed as the crowd began to disperse and return to their tables. Beth felt something she hadn't experienced in years, a sense of belonging, of being truly seen and valued for who she was rather than what she appeared to be. The scars on her arms were still there, but they no longer felt like marks of shame. They were evidence of survival, proof of service, symbols of sacrifice that had finally been recognized for what they truly were, unknown to everyone in the restaurant except Tank, who had noticed her early in the evening. Sarah, the young server, had been recording key moments of the confrontation on her phone. She had started filming when Chase first grabbed Beth's arm, initially thinking she was just capturing another entitled customer's bad behavior for her personal social media. But as Tank's story unfolded and the true nature of Beth's heroism became clear, Sarah realized she was witnessing something far more significant than a simple restaurant incident. Her hands shook as she held the phone, understanding that what she had captured could change everything for everyone involved. As soon as her shift ended, Sarah uploaded the video to multiple platforms with a simple caption, "A war hero gets the respect she deserves." The video began with Chase's cruel laughter and Beth's obvious distress, then captured Tank's intervention and powerful testimony about Beth's service. The contrast was stark, and emotional cruelty transformed into recognition, mockery, replaced by honor. Within the first hour, the video had been shared hundreds of times. By morning, it would reach millions. Meanwhile, Chase sat in his car in the restaurant parking lot, finally working up the courage to check his phone. The notifications seemed endless: messages, missed calls, social media alerts that made his stomach clench with dread. The video of his humiliation of Beth was everywhere, shared and reshared, with comments that grew increasingly harsh as more people learned the truth about who he had been tormenting. Disgusting behavior from someone who's never sacrificed anything. Read one comment: "This is what privilege looks like when it meets real heroism," said another. The hashtag #RespectOurVeterans was trending nationally, and Chase's name was being mentioned in connection with it in the worst possible way. His phone rang, and he saw his father's number on the screen. Chase's hands trembled as he answered, knowing what was coming. "Chase," came the furious voice of Morrison Sr. before his son could even say hello. "What the hell have you done? The board is in emergency session. We've lost 3 major clients in the past 2 hours." The panic and rage in his father's voice was something Chase had never heard before, and it sent a chill down his spine as he began to realize the true magnitude of what was happening. "Dad, I can explain," he started, but his father cut him off. Explain how you publicly humiliated a Medal of Honor nominee. Explain how you've made our family name synonymous with cruelty and ignorance." While Chase's world was collapsing, something beautiful was happening for Beth as she sat in Tank's truck outside the restaurant. Her own phone began buzzing with messages, but these were different. A text from an unknown number read, "Ma'am, I'm a Marine veteran from Texas. I just saw the video of what happened tonight. I wanted you to know that you represent everything good about our service. Thank you." Another message came from a woman in California. "My husband served 3 tours in Afghanistan. He saw your video and said you're the kind of soldier he was proud to serve alongside. Thank you for your sacrifice." The messages kept coming throughout the night, but the most significant response came the next morning, when Beth woke up to find that the Department of Defense had issued an official statement. Tank called her early, his voice filled with pride and excitement. "Beth, you need to check the news. The Secretary of Defense just released a statement about you. They're calling you an American hero and thanking you for your service. They're also announcing that they want to reschedule your Medal of Honor ceremony whenever you're ready." Beth sat in her small trailer reading the official statement on her phone with tears in her eyes. For years she had felt invisible, forgotten by the country she had served. But now, because of one night and one server's decision to record the truth, her story was being told to the world. The Department of Defense statement read in part, "Sergeant Beth Carter represents the very best of American values. Courage in combat, sacrifice for family and dignity in the face of adversity. Her service to our nation in Afghanistan and her continued service to her community deserve our highest respect and gratitude." The response wasn't universal praise, however. Some online commenters questioned whether the incident was real or staged, while others criticized Beth for not accepting the medal ceremony initially. But these negative voices were drowned out by an overwhelming wave of support from veterans, organizations, military families, and ordinary Americans who recognized authentic heroism when they saw it. The video had sparked a national conversation about how society treats its veterans, particularly those who don't fit the traditional image of what a hero should look like. Chase, meanwhile, was experiencing the full force of social media's power to destroy as quickly as it could elevate his personal. Social media accounts were flooded with angry messages. His family's business was facing boycotts, and reporters were calling his phone, constantly seeking comment. The young man who had walked into Grand View Restaurant as a respected member of high society was now one of the most reviled people on the internet. His friends had abandoned him. His social circle had closed ranks against him, and his father was threatening to cut him off financially unless he could somehow repair the damage to the family name. Sarah, the server, watched the viral explosion with a mixture of satisfaction and amazement. Her simple act of recording had sparked something much larger than she had anticipated, a national conversation about respect, service, and the real meaning of heroism. She had given Beth a platform to tell her story, and in doing so had reminded the entire country of the debt they owed to those who had served. As she watched the video's view count climb into the millions, Sarah felt proud of her small role in ensuring that Beth Carter finally received the recognition she had always deserved. The viral storm was just beginning, and its effects would reach far beyond a single restaurant incident, touching lives across the country, and forever changing how people thought about the quiet heroes who walked among them every day 6 months after that fateful night at Grand View Restaurant. Both Beth Carter and Chase Morrison had changed dramatically. Beth had become a spokesperson for Veteran Affairs, traveling the country to speak about challenges faced by returning service members. Her story had resonated with millions of Americans, and the small bakery, where she still worked part-time, had become a gathering place for local veterans. Beth wore her dog tag openly now, no longer hiding the symbol of her service, but wearing it as a badge of honor. Chase Morrison's transformation had been far more painful. The viral video had destroyed his reputation and severely damaged his family's business. He had been forced to resign from Morrison Industries and face the reality of who he had become. The months following the incident had been the darkest of his privileged life. His friends had abandoned him. His social circle had closed ranks against him, and he had been forced to move out of his luxury apartment when the lease wasn't renewed. The lowest point had come 3 months after the incident, when Chase found himself sitting alone in a diner at 2 o'clock in the morning, having been kicked out of yet another social gathering. When someone recognized him from the video, his phone buzzed with a text from his former best friend. "Saw you at the club tonight. Please don't contact me again. You're toxic and I can't be associated with you anymore." Chase stared at the message, feeling the full weight of his isolation. That night he realized he had 2 choices: continue down the path of self-pity, or find a way to become someone worthy of redemption. The next morning, Chase had walked into the Veterans Affairs office downtown and asked how he could volunteer. The receptionist had recognized him immediately, and her initial reaction had been hostile. "You've got some nerve showing up here," she had said coldly, but Chase had persisted, explaining that he wanted to do something meaningful with his life. Eventually, they had agreed to let him start with basic tasks: filing paperwork, cleaning offices, setting up chairs for meetings. Now, 6 months later, Chase was volunteering at a veteran support fundraiser in the same community center where he had been doing unpaid work for months. He wore a simple polo shirt and jeans, his expensive suit long since sold to help pay bills. His name tag reads simply volunteer, and he moved quietly through the room, setting up chairs and helping wherever needed. when Beth took the stage as the evening's keynote speaker. Chase stopped his work to listen. Beth stood at the podium wearing a navy blue suit, her dog tag clearly visible and catching the light. "We don't need to be treated as heroes or objects of pity," she told the audience. "We just need to be respected as human beings who have served our country and are trying to rebuild our lives." Her words carried the authority of someone who had learned to find her voice again. In the back of the room, Chase felt tears forming as he listened to the woman he had once humiliated speak with such grace and dignity during a break in the program. Chase was helping a disabled veteran named Marcus navigate his wheelchair through the crowded room when the man's prosthetic leg became caught on a chair as Chase knelt down to help free it. Marcus looked at him suspiciously. "I know who you are," the veteran said quietly. "You're the guy from that video. Why are you here?" Chase's face wrinkled, but he continued working to free the prosthetic. "I'm trying to be better than I was," he said simply. "I know I can't undo what I did, but I can try to do something useful with my life." Marcus studied Chase's face for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "Actions matter more than words," he said. "Keep showing up, keep doing the work, and maybe people will start to believe you mean it." As Chase helped Marcus to a better seat, Beth watched from across the room. She had been observing Chase's volunteer work for weeks, noting how he never sought attention, how he took on menial tasks without complaint, how he treated every veteran with respect regardless of their condition. After the event ended, Beth approached Chase as he was stacking chairs in the back of the room. He looked surprised to see her and immediately stopped what he was doing. "Beth," he said quietly, "I know you probably don't want to talk to me, but I wanted you to know that what happened that night changed my life. I'm not looking for forgiveness or trying to make myself feel better. I just wanted you to know that I'm trying to be different." Beth studied his face, seeing something that had been completely absent 6 months ago: genuine humility and remorse. "I don't need you to change for me, Chase," she said finally, "but I hope you don't let anyone else experience the kind of cruelty you showed me that night." Chase nodded, understanding that this was likely the only closure he would ever receive. "I won't," he said simply. "I can't promise I'll never make mistakes, but I can promise I'll never deliberately hurt someone the way I hurt you." Beth stepped up to the microphone for her final remarks. "Last year, I learned that true strength doesn't come from hiding our past, but from being proud of who we've become because of it," she said, her voice carrying clearly through the room. "And sometimes the people who hurt us the most can become the ones who help us grow the strongest if they're truly willing to change." She looked out at the audience, her eyes finding Chase in the back row where he was quietly finishing his cleanup duties. "Real redemption isn't about grand gestures or public apologies. It's about showing up every day and doing the work, even when nobody's watching." As the crowd dispersed, Beth paused at the door to look back. Chase was still there quietly, putting away the last chairs. Not because anyone was watching, but because it was the right thing to do. For the first time since that night at Grandview Restaurant, Beth felt something approaching. Forgiveness, not because Chase deserved it, but because holding on to anger was a burden she no longer wanted to carry from all of us.